Hi there, thank you so much for joining our retirement planning Q&A today. We wanted to put this on in relation to Pension Week, just because we realised that pensions are a very complex subject and we wanted to make information available to everyone, whether you were just starting off in pension savings or even getting to drawdown. We wanted to make this relevant to you. Now, before we get into anything, I just want to run through the agenda in a bit more detail. So we're just going to have a very brief presentation, just to kind of run through some regulatory bits. We're then going to go into the 3 stages of retirement, which is starting off with your retirement journey, actually getting towards retirement and saving towards retirement as well, and then actually getting to the point of drawdown as well. Now, this is going to be a very interactive Q&A. We're going to be trying to answer as many questions as possible while you tune in. And also what we're going to be doing is focusing on questions that have already been sent over to us. Now, we do have a team of people in the background who will be also answering any questions that we can't get round to. So do please put as many questions as you want to in the Q&A, which will be on the Zoom link, which you should be able to just see if you hover your cursor towards the bottom there. Now, to go through everything in a bit more detail and just cover a little bit of regulatory information here. As with all investing, your capital is at risk. The value of your investments can go down as well as up, and you may get back less than what you invested. A private pension may not be right for everyone. Tax treatment depends on your individual circumstances and may be subject to change in the future. Projections are never a perfect predictor of future performance and are intended as an aid to decision making, not as a guarantee. This publication does not contain and should not be taken as containing investment advice, personal recommendations, or an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any financial instruments. Prospective investors should seek their own independent financial, tax, legal, and other advice before making any investment decisions. So we've gone through the legal bit and the regulatory bit, so let's get into everything in a bit more detail. So what I want to do is just introduce everyone today. So we have Michelle Gribbin, who is from Profile Pensions. Michelle is actually the Chief Investment Officer there and also heads up the advisory function. So we're very lucky to have Michelle here today. And then we also have Peter, who is also a Senior Investment Consultant and works along myself. And again, myself, I am a investment consultant, but I will be hosting today. So mainly you will be speaking with these two. So just to kind of get into everything and throw ourselves into the deep end, what I want to kind of speak about is getting into pension saving and actually starting to save for your pension and starting early. So Peter, one thing that I wanted to ask you is, why do you think it's important to start saving early?
It's important to start early as it gives you probably the best opportunity to not play catch up later on. And it just means that you won't have to overpay into your pension further down the line. Mm-hmm. If you do start out early, of course, it means that your investments will grow in line with the market, and you also benefit from the compounding effects of both dividends and any additional tax relief, which you also may receive. You know, if you're early in your working career, you know, you may have more liquid need of your assets. You know, if you're family planning or whether you're looking to purchase your first property, you know, you may not necessarily think a pension may be quite important. Mm-hmm. But, you know, that being said, you know, if you do a small contribution, say once a month, it keeps things ticking over and it instills a good sort of saving habit moving forward, which will, you know, help you out further down the line.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Michelle?
I think there's a really good opportunity when you're starting out with your employer, with them making contributions and setting up that plan for you. Mm-hmm. So whilst you're relatively inexperienced in terms of savings and investments, you've got someone to help you with that planning. Mm-hmm. And I also think there's a really good opportunity for somebody starting out in employment before they get on the mortgage ladder or start a family, start paying major bills. They've got a little bit more disposable income, though it might not feel like it at the time. Mm-hmm. And that's a really good opportunity to start that habit of saving and getting those monies into a pension, I think.
Definitely. And I guess for people who have started things like auto-enrolment, you also get kind of a compounding impact of that longer term growth, would you say?
Absolutely. And I think as well, it becomes, if you start the pension early on, it becomes something that you're then used to paying out. So over time, you've got a chance to add to that, to change it, but you've started that habit of saving.
Definitely. And there is something that I just want to touch on in relation to that. If I can just bring up my screen quickly. Let me see if I can. Perfect. So what I want to touch on here is just kind of 3 scenarios in relation to kind of auto-enrolment and things like that. And to give you the scenarios very briefly. So if we look at employee A decides to opt in to auto-enrolment and they put £500 a month into a pension for 40 years. Now, in that time, they have contributed £240,000 into a pension, but at the end and at retirement, they would have £726,930 roughly, based on a 5% growth, okay? If we then look at employee B, who continues to invest but puts an extra £200 in a month, it works out to be £700 a month rather than £500. They would have contributed £336,000, but would have over £1 million in their investment pot overall. And then one thing that I found really interesting when doing the research is looking at employee C. Now, employee C decided to opt out of pension contributions when they were younger, wanted a little bit more disposable income to play around with, which is fine. Later on in life, employee C decided at 42, I do want to actually invest into a pension. And they still had 20 years to do that, which is great. Now, one thing that's really interesting is you can see that employee A and employee C both ended up investing £240,000 into their pension. The only difference is that employee A had 40 years of compounding and employee B had 20 years of compounding. And what you can see is there is a huge impact and a huge difference in regards to the compounding there. That employee A had a pot of about 726,000, whereas employee C had a pot of 416,000. Okay, so a difference in gain of roughly £250,000, which obviously is a huge impactor when you're looking at a small contribution that's coming out on a monthly basis, right? But let's kind of move on and have a little look at some more important areas as well when we're looking outside of kind of compound interest. And what I want to just find out a little bit more about is what are your kind of views, Michelle, on auto-enrolment compared to, you know, someone who's looking at like a SIPP. What would someone who's getting an auto-enrolment need to look at and consider?
Okay, so auto-enrolment is absolutely a key part to making sure that people have enough provision in retirement. So what auto-enrolment does is ensures that everybody has access to a pension who's working and tries to encourage people to make sure they take advantage of that, because importantly, not just are you paying into your pension, but your employer's contributing as well, often matching the more you pay into your plan. I think it's really important the sooner you start to pay into a pension, the better chance you have, as we've just seen, of growing that fund. And with your employer paying contributions, paying contributions and tax relief, it means you've got a really good chance of building up that money over time. I think in terms of auto-enrolment, what you do need to make sure you do is keep on top of the payments you're making in terms of making sure that it's invested in the right way for you. So often people have quite a long-term time horizon to their retirement age. So it's important to make sure that money is invested in the most efficient way that it can be invested for you to maximise returns. And very often in an auto-enrolment scheme, it's a set fund. Your employer will put you into a default fund. It's important that you as the employee take ownership of that and review that and make sure it's invested appropriately for you. I think one of the other pitfalls is over time you may move employment and that money gets left to grow, but it's often left unmanaged. So again, it's important that you're taking advantage of looking at that fund, perhaps consolidating and making sure that you keep on top of the amounts that you've got building up in total towards your retirement.
And it's interesting you said about kind of those pensions that get forgotten, because I think a lot of things change when it actually comes to leaving your company. Things like charges as well is one thing that can sometimes change. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add, Peter, on that?
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, I think it's quite easy to sort of lose track of all these workplace pensions. I think the average UK person will have 11 careers over their timeline, so they will therefore have 11 workplace pensions. It's quite easy to lose track of these, as I mentioned. So there are sort of resources available out there to chase up all these lost pensions. Profile pension being one of them. The government also has another. So it's just making sure you know where they are, understanding the fee structures in place, and whether they're appropriate for you. A company like Moneyfarm can obviously give you a good recommendation in terms of making sure it's the right or the most suitable pension profile for yourself. And it just gives you a clear idea of where you are and what stage you're at in terms of your retirement planning. I think quite often a lot of these formal workplace pensions will send you, maybe one document a year. A lot of the information is quite opaque. So, if you can centralise it in one place, it just gives you a better standing moving forward in terms of, what I need to do in terms of, making the next steps towards retirement.
It's probably worth mentioning as well, the options that you have for retirement tend to change over time. So because you've got a relatively long time until you retire, what's available now and what's the right thing for you now will change throughout time. And by keeping on top of and managing your pension, or getting someone to do that for you, it means that you're keeping up to date with what's available and making sure you are making the absolute best of every investment opportunity for your pension.
Definitely. And just to touch on a few questions that have come through from the public here, very specific actually, and things that are very key, is one for you, Peter. I am a sole trader. Can I still receive tax relief on my contributions?
So unlike, say, other forms of employer contributions where you wouldn't necessarily receive tax relief, it is actually treated as a business expense being a sole trader. So you would actually claim that as the relevant amount of tax relief on that. So yeah, they would definitely would.
Okay, perfect. And one thing to touch on as well, we've looked at auto-enrolment, which of course is key, but we need to look at people that are self-employed, right? This is a massive problem that we see, especially as consultants, is that a lot of people who are self-employed tend to start pensions a little later on in life, unless they're super, super prepared. And a lot of people think, is it too late for me? How can I actually start investing? What's the best SIPP and things like that? So I guess to start, how do you think a good way to start investing is, Peter?
In regard to self-employed?
Yeah, in regards to self-employed people, ad hoc contributions, monthly contributions, do you think there's a preference there, or?
It can depend slightly on each person's circumstance, but I think, again, what we mentioned earlier, if it's small contributions going through it every now and again, you won't necessarily notice it too much leaving the company account. That being said, if you are sort of more predispositioned to see what money is available at the end of the business tax year, there are a lot of tax benefits when making a company contribution. So if you want to see, how much I can remove from my corporation tax liability, you may want to do an ad hoc payment towards the end of the year, but obviously you need to be in a comfortable position to do that.
That's a really good point. And just to kind of talk a little bit more about the tax relief and things, especially for self-employed people, do you think there's anything that our self-employed people should be aware of?
Yeah, so first of all, you've got the obvious one, which is tax relief. So every time you pay money into your pension, you get tax relief on top of that. It's probably worth mentioning as well for people who have a limited company, pension contributions can be offset as a business expense, so that means you will pay reduced tax and national insurance contributions as a business and receive tax relief. So there are some definite benefits to doing that.
Definitely. Perfect. So just to kind of move on a little bit more, and thank you, Peter and Michelle, for going through that, I just want to focus on a little bit more about clients who are approaching retirement, maybe not there yet, but really starting to seriously think, God, I need to actually start investing, okay? Now, in regards to these people, what do you think are the main things clients should consider when actually approaching retirement?
Okay, so shall I start there? So for customers who are coming towards, or people who are coming towards retirement, I think what we're looking at here is affordability. So it's looking at considerations such as what income do I have now? What income will disappear when I retire? So what will my income needs be in retirement? What other sources of income do I have? Things like state pension, will I work part-time? Do I have any inheritances? Do I plan to downsize my property? So what are the total sources of income and capital that you have available to you? From there, you can make a plan as to how your retirement might look and when you can afford to retire. So for example, there are many more options available now than there've ever been in terms of retirement, in that you can retire flexibly. So for example, you can choose to work part-time and draw down on your pension income at the same time. You can take your tax-free cash separately than your pension income, and that can be used either for a lump sum, such as paying off your mortgage or that fancy retirement holiday, or of course it can be used as a tax-free income stream to supplement your income in retirement. You've got flexibility when you take that money, so you can now choose to take your money later, or of course if you don't need that money, if you're in that really nice position, that money can be left to grow tax efficiently and can be left for beneficiaries and passed down to them. So there are so many options now and flexibility for people coming up to retirement. It's a case of having a good look and planning ahead to make sure that you tailor your retirement planning to your individual circumstances.
Definitely. And I think that's such a key point you made there, because so many people get to this point and think, oh my God, how much do I actually need for retirement? And I think this is a point where you really need to sit down, with an advisor or someone to really assess, what are my assets, what are my liabilities, and what actually do I need for retirement? Because a lot of people know that they need a pot, but they don't know at all how much they actually need. And also kind of a cost of living, inflation, we all know what that's like at the moment. So it's more important than ever, really, to kind of have a look at these things. I mean, Peter, is there anything you would add in regards to kind of retirement gap, anything like that, or?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think this is a phrase which is becoming more and more into sort of the UK psyche, really, because I think there's a big issue, especially with a lot of Britons, that there is a significant shortfall in terms of what their desired retirement income is and what they actually have in place for them. So Moneyfarm, recently did some research on this for customers who are over 50, and the average saver has a £155,000 shortfall in their pension. On top of that, I mean, the UK government also did some research as well, and they highlighted that there was a 35% gap between both male and female pensions for people around sort of pension age. So it goes to show that, planning as early as you can make you think, okay, what do I need to do? What steps do I need to take? And maximise contributions wherever possible, so that, when you do retire, you can do so in the style that you deserve.
And I've just brought up a few statistics in relation to this, just to kind of highlight the importance of, what we are actually expecting people to need on an annual basis to be able to afford very basic, essential, comfortable and luxury lifestyles. And I think it's a bit of a shocker when people see these figures, because essential lifestyle, when we looked into it, it's literally things as one holiday in the UK with your children every year and small things like that, okay? And you can see that with the cost of living going up, these points are so key to look into at the moment. And I think that's where a lot of people start to worry, am I actually saving enough? So thank you so much for going through that. I think that's a really, really key point for a lot of our clients at the moment as well. So let's have a little look at a few questions that have actually come in. So one that we've got, which I feel we may cover a little bit later down the line, but is still one we want to talk about, is once you take advantage of your 25% tax-free lump sum, can you continue to make contributions into the SIPP? What are the tax rules? Michelle, could you answer this one?
Of course, yes. So that's really a key question, because a lot of people now choose to take their tax-free cash and then carry on, either working or saving into a pension. So the rules are that you can take up to 25% of your money as a tax-free cash allowance, and as long as you don't go over that 25%, you can continue to pay into your pension up until your annual allowance. So the annual allowance currently stands at 60,000, or your salary, whichever is the lower. Once you go over the 25%, however, then that changes slightly and the money purchase annual allowance kicks in, which means that you've got a limit of £10,000 a year that you can pay into pension in terms of contributions. And that 10,000 and 60,000 or your salary is the gross amount. So you get your tax relief is included within that amount.
Perfect, thank you for that. And one question that we've received, which is very, very relevant actually, is in regards to consolidation, okay? And this one, Peter, is why do you think consolidation is important?
I think there's three key aspects of consolidation which we need to consider. Firstly, there's the fees. So with each, say for example, you have 5 different pensions with different providers, you will be paying a fee with each respective organisation. Usually the way in which organisations are set up is that you'll pay a higher fee for a small amount invested. So if you can consolidate with one provider, you increase your probability that you'll pay a lower fee with that provider. On top of that as well, it gives you greater control of having the correct risk profile for yourself. As Michelle mentioned earlier, you can be put into a default fund with any given provider, something which may be completely inappropriate for your given situation, how close you are to retirement. For example, if you're a young person in a low risk fund, you can most likely afford to take a higher degree of risk because you've got longer until you actually have to retire. If you're in a high risk investment, but retiring next year, again, you may be exposed to too much market volatility at that point. So again, unsuitable. By having it all in one place, it gives you greater control, greater visibility on where you stand, and it's just a good way of just knowing, as a checkpoint, okay, where am I going with the pension? Lastly, which is maybe a bit more of a smaller point, but it reduces the administrative burden for yourself. You get 1,000 emails from different providers telling you to check in on different documents, X, Y, Z. But actually, if you have it all homed in one place, then you have a consistent sort of narrative coming through of what's happening with your pension, what's happening with your investments, and it just gives you sort of a greater peace of mind.
Definitely, and I think that's a big point there is simplicity, right? Pensions as a whole sector can be really confusing, can be overwhelming to say the least. And when you're looking at doing drawdown on 5, 6, 7 pensions, you've got all the drawdown forms, you've got everything else to worry about alongside actually, planning the right retirement for you. So one thing I would always say is simplicity really does need to be considered here, because when it comes to consolidation, it can really help alleviate that stress, which is good. But just to have a little look at a few questions here, one person has asked, when do you think the retirement age is going to increase from 55 up to 57?
Well, that's set in stone. It's going to increase from 55 to 57 in 2028, and it increases on a phase basis for people depending on their dates of birth around that time. Thereafter, the retirement age is reviewed every 2 years, and that is based on the ability to pay out pensions to however many people are actually in the age of retirement. So it's a 2-year review.
Yeah, and I think state pensions are a really interesting point to just touch on quickly, because I think a lot of our clients and a lot of people are concerned of the stability of kind of, long-term state pension. What's your kind of views on state pension? Do you feel it is kind of a secure long-term product, or...?
So I've worked in financial services for about 30 years now, and it's been a question that has always been on customers' minds. What will happen? Will there be a state pension? I'm not going to plan for my state pension. My view on that is that we have a state benefit system. So in one way or another, for people who haven't got monies in the pension, there will be some kind of income. That is basically the basis of our government and how we actually work. But whether that will be for people who don't have income, or whether that will, people who've built up their own pension provision, whether it will always be there, I'm unsure.
Definitely. Okay, thank you for that. And just a few questions we've got in actually are more in relation to the defined benefit scheme side of things. So just to go into this in a bit more detail, obviously there's defined contribution schemes, defined benefit schemes. A lot of schemes these days do kind of lean towards defined contribution unless you're in kind of public sector and things. But I mean, Peter, what's your views on kind of defined benefit schemes? If you're looking at the scheme as a whole, what's good about it, potentially potentially what's the negatives when you're looking at those?
So, as you mentioned, they're becoming increasingly rare. They're becoming increasingly difficult to manage. However, if you do want, it can be significantly beneficial for you. Essentially, something like a SIPP, the onus is on you slightly to take control and manage, obviously with the help of advice and guidance with other institutions. But with defined benefit, the responsibility is almost taken from your hands. It's the amount which you receive is slightly calculated on how long you spend with a given organisation, the salary which you receive, and something which is called the accrual rate, so how much you sort of calculate to get that final salary at the end of it. But the one thing I would mention with a defined benefit pension is that you will have a guaranteed income when you retire. The pension scheme themselves will set a retirement date, so I think you'll give it a lot of sort of forward guidance of what to expect. But they're incredibly valuable and incredibly rare. So I think for a lot of people, I think people will be quite envious of it. In terms of potential drawbacks, is that they don't carry the same portability as say a direct, a SIPP would, for example. By that I mean so if you're planning for your estate, then of course you can't necessarily leave it behind in the same way that you could with a SIPP. Mm-hmm. So for example, with defined contribution schemes, you can leave it outside of your estate, so it avoids the need the exposure to inheritance tax, whereas you wouldn't necessarily have the same option with the defined benefit scheme. Really?
Okay, that's really interesting. So with a defined benefit scheme, would that completely kind of die on your death? I hate to say it so morbidly, but would that not have a chance of being passed on to your loved ones?
So it very much depends on the scheme rules, but generally with a defined contribution scheme you own the pot, so that money is in your estate, so if anything happens to you, whatever's left goes into your estate and it can be left to your beneficiaries. Mm-hmm. In terms of a defined benefit scheme, mm-hmm. that is an income that's paid out, and on your death, assuming that's after retirement, it tends to be an income that's left to your beneficiaries. Mm-hmm. If you have any beneficiaries, it can't be left to anybody, it's to beneficiaries. And typically that tends to be a percentage of your funds, so typically half of your income that you have each year. I think the other key difference with your defined contribution scheme as opposed to your defined benefit scheme is flexibility. Yeah. So for example, with a defined contribution scheme, you can take your tax-free cash and your income separately. You can choose at what age you decide to start taking that income, regardless of when you actually are retiring from your work. So for example, in a defined benefit scheme, it may have a set retirement age, and it may be that you take that at the same time as you finish working. Can be taken separately, but it'll be within set parameters. So typically, if it's, for example, the scheme's got an age of 65 for retirement and you go earlier, you'll pay a penalty to take that. You'll get a reduced income. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So advantage of defined benefit scheme, of course, is that you've got guaranteed defined benefits with a defined beneficiary's pension. However, you lose the flexibility with that and the ability to leave that to your loved ones.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And thank you so much for answering those questions. So we've looked at kind of, getting towards retirement, consolidation, reviewing your portfolios with an advisor and things. But one thing that I think is really key is that, when you are, let's say, 40s to 50s, typically you are in kind of a height of your career, right? You've got to where you want to be, you're earning well usually, things like children are starting to grow up, expenses typically are going down, we hope. And because of that, I think it's very much important to look at how people can also maximise contributions at this stage if they are scared about their shortfall. So one thing that I just wanted to touch on is just in regards to kind of the changes we've seen this year in 2023 that could potentially benefit our clients, just in regards to the mini budget. So Michelle, if you could make a few comments on that would be amazing.
So there were two key changes that took effect this year. So one of them being the lifetime allowance. So previously there was a maximum allowance that pension savers could get to in order to get tax benefits on their pension. That was removed in the mini budget. There still remains a maximum tax-free cash that you can take. However, the actual amount you can save and take tax efficiently is that allowance is now removed. The second change was to the annual allowance. So we mentioned this earlier. So the annual allowance is the amount that you can pay into your pension each year, subject to your earnings. Previously, that was 40,000, and that has been increased to 60,000, which is significant in terms of allowing people to maximise payments into pensions tax efficiently.
Yeah, basically 50% more, right, that you can put into a pension. So a huge benefit there for
Absolutely.
people. One thing to be aware of with that is that it is typically your salary or the 60,000, whichever is actually lower. So it's good to make sure that, you know, you're not putting more than your own annual allowance in. But definitely that's a really key point. You know, if you are a bit concerned about your retirement shortfall, you now have a little bit more flexibility in regards to how much you actually can invest, right? And it's important to kind of use these allowances to benefit yourself, okay? But just another thing to look into while we're on this subject is actually backdating and carrying forward previous contributions. Now, a lot of our clients do ask us questions on that. I mean, Peter, could you give a little bit of a run through on carrying forward and how it works?
Sure. So carry forward is essentially the process of using up any unused pension allowance which you may hold from the 3 previous tax years. So it's on a rolling basis. So with that in mind, so, you know, if you had £30,000, you know, across the total of the 3 previous years, which was unused, you could actually contribute to that in the current tax year. The one thing I would add to that first is that you should always seek professional guidance and advice on this, because it can be quite tricky and difficult to calculate. But one of the key things to note is that you must always maximise your current annual allowance before using up any spare allowance which you have from previous tax years. It does start and begin with the earliest tax year, so you do benefit on that rolling basis. But again, I think, you know, as you're maybe approaching retirement, you know, you've got maybe a higher salary, you've got, you know, less costs associated with dependents, then, you know, this is the perfect time to sort of make up any sort of shortfall which you may have with your pension.
And I think that carry forward is a huge thing to focus on, especially when we're looking at the annual allowances, because let's say someone hasn't saved into their pension at all. Let's say they've had a pension open, okay, so they do qualify for the carry forwards, but let's say year 1 they didn't contribute, year 2 they didn't, year 3. That could ultimately be £40,000 per year that you would be eligible to put into a pension, right? So that's 120,000. And if you're looking at this year with a 60,000 allowance, if you qualify for that, then ultimately you could put £180,000 into a pension, right? So it's a really key thing to think about, because, you know, inheritance, large lump sums that people do inherit, you know, that's when you've got to think about what kind of tax efficiency do I want on this. And that's when we do kind of see people really utilize their pension, okay? So thank you so much for that, guys. That's really, really helpful. Now, one question we have, which is quite interesting, is if I am a part-time worker and I have inherited a lump sum, can I invest it into a pension? And I think hopefully that should have answered it anyway, but yes, ultimately you can. You know, you need to, of course, invest within your means and make sure that you are, of course, eligible for things like tax relief and allowances, and make sure you don't go over those. But yes, you can. And that's one nice thing, because you have kind of the tax efficiency on that as well, which is good. So let's have a little look at some other points. One thing that I want to delve into now is actually clients that are getting to drawdown, right? So we've looked at clients early on in retirement, looked at clients who are kind of approaching and planning for retirement, but let's kind of talk about actually getting to the decision and how you want to start drawing down. Now, what I want to talk about is the big question that a lot of people do face, which is annuity versus drawdown, right? So I just want to kind of ask you, Michelle, what is your kind of view on the pros and cons of drawdown versus annuity? Do you have a preference?
So I think it absolutely depends on the needs of an individual and what your preferences are. So the obvious advantage of an annuity is that it gives you a guaranteed income for life. So you've got a predetermined amount that's going to stay the same throughout your retirement. The disadvantage of that, of course, is that you are predetermining that income now, so your circumstances could change, or annuity rates could increase, or something could happen that means you don't need that same level of income, but you've given away your lump sum from your pension pot in order to receive that income. You don't get it back. Mm-hmm. The other clear disadvantage of an annuity is that if something happens to you, generally that money doesn't pass to your beneficiaries, it dies with you. Mm-hmm. So the value for money from an annuity really depends how long you live after you start taking that annuity. Mm-hmm. The advantages of drawdown are that it's completely flexible, so you can start at a level of income, you can change that if your circumstances change. If anything happens to you, that money then passes down, so it doesn't matter in terms of value for money at what point during your retirement that you pass away. So that's a clear advantage. However, the disadvantage of a flexible drawdown arrangement is that you've no guarantee. So your money continues to be invested and can go down as well as up. Equally, if your needs change or you run out of money, you take the money out of that pot, then there's nothing left there for your retirement.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, Peter, is there anything you'd like to add in regards to your views on annuities versus drawdown?
Yeah, I think the key point is can you afford to live off other means whilst you can still afford to let your pension grow? If the annuity, once you set it in stone, that's not moving, that's not changing. And again, if there are, if you can afford from other means in the meantime, whether you're receiving other sets of income, whether that's part-time work or through other vehicles such as ISAs or other savings, then again, it gives you the chance for your investments to continue going through time and access them whenever you may need them. Mm-hmm. On top of that, in terms of, if you are planning for, when you do pass, what you're leaving behind, as we mentioned earlier, the defined contribution schemes are actually held outside of the estate. So actually, whether you may not need this as a source of income, you can actually leave these to your beneficiaries and your dependents, once you pass.
Mm-hmm. There's something else that's worth mentioning as well in terms of flexibility or annuity. You can actually change your mind. So if you go for a flexible drawdown option, at any time you can buy an annuity. So for example, at some point during your retirement, you can choose to buy an annuity when perhaps you're older, mm-hmm. or if you're in ill health, because if you're in ill health, then potentially you can get a better annuity rate. Mm-hmm. So, you can't go backwards with an annuity. Once you buy an annuity, you can't go back to flexible drawdown. Mm-hmm. But with flexible drawdown, you can at any point choose to take an annuity. So you've got a little bit of flexibility there.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And you know what, we've had a few questions come in on the drawdown piece, which are really interesting, and some of them are actually in regards to kind of looking at alternative assets, okay, because a lot of the time when you think of retirement, you think pensions, defined benefits, annuities, but let's have a look at other kind of saving vehicles that people might be using. For example, the benefits of drawing from an ISA rather than a pension. I mean, Michelle, have you got any comments on kind of ISAs?
So I think it goes back to what we said earlier about taking into consideration all your assets and all your income that you've got coming in. So looking at, do I have a property, for example, that I want to downsize? Have I got a property where I'm getting an income? Because that can be a really good sort of a reliable income throughout retirement. What investments can I take income from and how tax efficiently can I do that? Mm-hmm. So for example, with ISAs, you can take that income tax efficiently as well as your pension to supplement that. It may be that you use some of your money from your investments initially to allow your pension to carry on growing tax efficiently and then draw that later. Mm-hmm. You've got lots of options. When you initially start taking your pension, that's taxed as income. So what you can do is use your tax-free investments, i.e. your ISA, and your tax-free allowance from your pension to supplement that, mm-hmm. to make it more tax efficient. There's lots of different ways where you can access your monies really tax efficiently using a combination of all your different types of assets.
Makes sense.
Equally, throughout retirement, it may be that you come into money via inheritance, for example, and you can make the use of allowances there by paying into ISAs and again using those tax efficiently, or contributing to pension subject to your allowances again, to make that as tax efficient as possible.
Definitely. And one thing that you mentioned there, which I think is a really interesting point, is that when it comes to drawing down, some people may decide to kind of start drawing down on things like ISAs or properties or things if they can. And that really does tie into kind of estate planning and inheritance tax, because like we said earlier, when it comes to defined contribution schemes, they do typically sit outside of your estate. And one good thing about that is that typically they won't be eligible for inheritance tax, right? So if you are, let's say, in a good position where you think you are going to have funds to pass on to your loved ones, potentially you may look at taking things and benefits from ISAs or other alternative investments first. Absolutely. Compared to kind of like a pension if you did want to pass it down in the most tax efficient way. Obviously I would always say this is something to get advice on and definitely something to look into in more detail because it's a very complex area, but it is definitely something to flag. Now we do have a question, which is, how would you recommend splitting savings into ISAs versus pensions? And this person's between, they're saying 50-50, or do you kind of recommend in a different way?
So my first comment would be, it depends on how accessible you need that money to be and what age you are. So first of all, you can't start drawing on your pension till 55 at the moment or 57. So it would depend on what term you need that money for. Obvious benefit of a pension is you get tax relief on payments that go in, but equally you get 25% tax free on the way out, but you're taxed on the remainder. Whereas with an ISA, no tax relief on the way in, but it comes out tax free. So it's a case of weighing it up. I would say that in most circumstances, you would be looking at a combination of the two if you had a sizable sum. But I think that depends on your individual circumstances and your accessibility needs.
Makes sense completely. And just another question to look at here, and this is a really key one actually, and one for you, Peter, is it too late to start a pension at 41? Is it a wasted effort? Is it better to open an investment ISA? So kind of similar with the investment ISA side, but I think the big point here is it too late when you're 41?
Not necessarily. I mean, again, it depends completely on your personal situation and maybe how liquid you need your assets and the accessibility of getting those at a given point in time. If you generally are saving for retirement and say, for example, you're a higher additional tax rate payer, you do get additional tax relief on top of the basic rate, which you may get with, the pension organisation which you may invest with currently. So when you begin to the cost of that contribution to you reduces significantly if you're in one of these higher tax rate bands. But again, when you begin drawing down from your pension, I think one thing which people maybe overlook is that, you do have the 75% taxable portion, but you can draw on this in a very tax efficient manner. So each individual in the UK has a personal allowance of £12,570, where all income underneath that is considered tax free. So if you are beginning to take pension, if you contribute at a higher tax rate, you're getting tax relief on top of that. And if you're working underneath the pension, the personal allowance on the tail end of it, then again, you're still getting that tax-free benefit. But again, if you're maybe not in that position or you have sort of more short-term needs, then again, that's maybe where something more like an ISA may be a bit more suitable for yourself.
Perfect. And I think a big point with that one is it's never too late, right? Kind of any saving that you can put into a pension is key, right? If you're not contributing, then you won't have it. If you are contributing, even if it's a small amount later on in life, you are going in the right direction and that is going to support your retirement. So one thing I would always say on that is if you are starting saving, it's the best thing you can do. It doesn't matter how much it is, as long as it's comfortable for you and you are saving, then you're going to have something for retirement. Don't know if there's anything you'd like to add on that at all?
I don't think there is, other than in terms of saving for retirement now, monies are invested. You're not taking the money out at the point of retirement. Your monies are invested throughout your retirement if you're accessing them flexibly. So that potentially means the term for investment is a lot longer. So as Lily just said, that really means it's never too late. So even if you were starting to contribute into your 50s, even early 60s, that money potentially could be invested for a significant period of time because that money continues to grow right up until the time you stop using your pension fund.
Definitely, I completely agree. And one other question that I really want to focus on, and this is a big one that comes up a lot actually, is what are the pros and cons of crystallising your pension pot at the age of 55? So when you can, basically.
So maybe.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting about that, we get a lot of questions from people who are looking to access the pension at 55 because they think they should. Or because they think if they don't access it at 55, they will lose the opportunity to do that. So first of all, to put that myth to rest, if you don't access your pension at 55, it's still there to access whenever you want it. Mm-hmm. I think, again, this comes back to individual circumstance. So clearly, if you need to access your money at 55, that is absolutely fine. You can do that. But what the first thing you need to do really is to make sure that you've got enough money left in that pot for retirement. If you do access that money, there are ways you can mitigate the effects of that withdrawal by contributing into your pension, by consolidating other pensions into your pot. But the key thing here is making sure that at your retirement, i.e. when you finish work, you have got enough money to live on. Mm-hmm. Because the idea of retirement isn't you're at 55 now, so take the money out. The idea is that it's designed to provide an income in your retirement. Mm-hmm. And if you take that money now, if you need access to that while you're still working and still have an income, you need to probably question, how will I actually manage when I get to the point where I have no work income coming in? Mm. What happens if I need to finish work earlier because I'm unable to work anymore? And those are the kind of questions I would be asking myself if I was looking to access my pension earlier.
Makes sense. Anything you'd like to add on that?
The only thing I would probably say on top of that is that when you take your tax-free amount, it's seen in percentage terms. So for example, if you're working until the age of 65, you've got 10 years worth of hopefully market growth to see actually your pension actually grow quite significantly in that time period, and you can still have access to that 25%. So again, it's just making sure you're not sort of selling yourself short slightly just because you have access to it now. Doesn't sometimes necessarily mean that you should.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And one thing that I would add on that is that ultimately, with the 25% tax-free lump sum, which is great that we get that and we can receive that, is that we do typically tend to see clients access that as kind of a first straw. Like, okay, great, I'm at retirement, I'm going to access my 25% tax-free lump sum, which is great. You can do that, and for a lot of clients, it may be the best option. For example, if you're still working, you've got a higher tax bracket and things like that, people may choose to do that. But on your point, Peter, one thing to think of is if you do leave some or all of your 25% tax-free lump sum, as your pension hopefully grows, ultimately that tax-free amount will grow as well. So it's very much important to kind of think about, do I need that tax-free amount now? Or do I want to save a little bit of that to grow over time as well for when I draw down?
I think that's worth mentioning as well, that when you come to retirement, whether that's at 55, 65, whatever age that is, it doesn't necessarily need to be that you take that 25% as a lump sum. Very often that can be managed as an income stream to make your income more tax efficient and allow you to take a little bit more from your pension and receive the monthly amount you want. So you can gradually over time take a combination of, for example, money's up to your personal allowance and some of your tax-free cash stream to make sure you're maximising your tax allowances and getting the most from your income in retirement.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you both. And just a few other questions just from the public here. Is we've got one for you, Peter, which is, once you start drawing down from your pension fund, can you actually transfer it to another provider?
The answer is yes. It does become slightly more difficult in terms of, moving it from one place to another. But the general idea with, say, for example, a SIPP or when you're in flexible access drawdown is that it's still fundamentally flexible. Mm-hmm. I think it's always good to have an open discussion with whoever your, the receiving provider may be, whether they can actually can they do this for you? Just so in case you go down a path and you can't sort of backtrack at any point. But again, it is possible, but again, it's worth having a conversation with the relevant provider at that time.
Mm. And you say it becomes more difficult. Is that because it's like crystallised? Is that because providers just don't want to take it on when it's in drawdown, or is it something else?
So you can't necessarily take down, transfer a drawdown instruction. So if you're taking an income at that point in time, it becomes quite challenging nigh on impossible to actually transfer it across. If it is crystallised, so when you are actually taking benefits from the pension, whether, if an instruction is not in place, it is still feasible. Yeah.
Perfect. And thank you so much. We've covered a lot today in regards to kind of different age brackets, where you're at with retirement. One thing that I really want to kind of close on here as we're approaching the end is a little bit more in regards to estate planning and actually inheritance tax, because I think this is a really key point and something that's really important to look at if you are in a bit more of a privileged position where you do want to pass some wealth onto your loved ones. How do you do it? Because with inheritance tax, it's a very high percentage to pay, and that typically has to be paid by your loved ones before you even access the estate, right? So Michelle, it'd be great to get your opinions on kind of ways you can estate plan when looking at your pension and other assets.
So the obvious one is that monies that remain in your pension fund are outside of your estate for inheritance tax purposes, and you can choose who you leave those to. So you can be very clear about where you want them to go without any tax on them. In terms of flexibility, there is flexibility for those beneficiaries in terms of how they take that money. So they can choose to leave the money invested in a pension plan and draw an income from it, or they can take the money out straight away, as we said, without inheritance tax. So I think there are some real key estate planning ways you can do this by speaking to somebody, getting advice on what to do with your property, looking at your pension, and making sure that when you draw monies down, and I think we touched on this earlier, as you draw monies down, perhaps drawing monies that would form part of your estate, such as investments, first, and leaving monies in pensions that remain outside of the estate.
Definitely. Is there anything you'd like to add, Peter, in regards to estate planning or?
The only thing I would say on top of that is that it's not necessarily always tax-free. So if, say, for example, with a defined contribution scheme, someone passes before the age of 75, you will actually receive that completely tax-free. If the person in question dies over the age of 75, the benefits which you receive are actually taxed at your income rate at that point in time. So you're not completely scot-free. However, there are other sort of factors to consider beyond just the inheritance tax aspect.
Perfect. And thank you so much for that. I feel like we've covered a lot of things, which is great. And we are wrapping up. We are coming to the end a little bit now, which is good. I just want to see if there are any other questions that we want to look at, just to close everything off. Bear with me. Let's have a little look. So this is a quite specific question, but one that is pretty important. So one of our clients has asked, does the previous lifetime contribution restriction impact on what can be rolled forward, so carry forward, into this year if one was at the maximum before the mini budgets?
So we're talking about annual allowance or lifetime allowance here?
So this is a lifetime contribution restriction.
Okay. So the lifetime contribution restriction has gone in terms of you can now pay above that amount and receive that tax efficiently. What remains is that the previous lifetime allowance, the tax-free cash you can draw is still restricted to 25% of that, which off the top of my head is, I think, £268,750. So that's the maximum tax-free cash you can pay in. So the annual allowance has changed, so you can pay more into your pension, and the lifetime allowance is no longer in effect, so you can carry on paying above that allowance, but it will restrict the amount of tax-free cash you can take.
Makes sense, and thank you for that. And one thing that I would say is, of course, we have mentioned some brief subjects today, but ultimately, us investment consultants are here and we are available through appointments, phone calls, video calls, anything to kind of discuss your more personal situation regarding, where you're at with retirement, whether it's you kind of deciding whether to make ad hoc contributions, monthly contributions, or whether it's a little bit more in depth, kind of looking at what assets you have, how you want to start drawing down and things like that. We can, of course, look at that as well. So one thing that I would always urge is, if you can, book an appointment just so we can speak with you, kind of find out about your situation and go from there as well. Now, one key point as well that we do want to touch on very briefly is over the next coming weeks, we are looking to actually release a pension promotion. There is going to be more information coming on this. However, one key point is that all of you who have tuned into this webinar will be eligible for that. And we will be sending an email within the next couple of days to register your interest to make sure that you will be applicable. So if you are looking at kind of consolidations, moving money into a pension, then definitely book an appointment, let us know, and we can even talk through that promotion in a bit more detail. But for now, I just want to thank the both of you. So thank you, Michelle, thank you, Peter. I hope you guys have all found this really informative as well. And one thing that I would say is there is going to be a very short survey, should take kind of 30 seconds or a minute of your time. If you do have time to feedback, that would be amazing. We're always trying to make these a bit more interactive, a little bit more interesting. So if you do have time, that would be great. But other than that, thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you so much for your time today.